1:53 a.m., northern Arabian Sea, 81 nautical miles southwest of the Strait of Hormuz. 14 Iranian kamikaze drones just crossed the outer radar threshold of USS Boxer and locked targeting coordinates on the ship's superstructure. The crew had less than 6 minutes before the first wave reached detonation range. What happened in those 6 minutes, and what the Navy found when it examined the wreckage, permanently changed how America defends its ships. Welcome. The drone threat to naval vessels is not a future problem. It is a present one. Unmanned aerial systems armed with explosive payloads, guided by GPS coordinates or optical terminal seekers, capable of operating in coordinated swarms. This is the weapon that keeps Navy commanders awake at night in a way that even ballistic missiles do not. A ballistic missile is expensive, traceable, and requires a nation-state with significant infrastructure to launch. A drone swarm can be assembled from commercial components, launched from a pickup truck on a shoreline, and directed by a single operator with a laptop. The cost exchange ratio is catastrophic. A $20,000 drone that kills a $40 million radar system or cripples a $2 billion warship represents an asymmetric military achievement that no conventional naval doctrine was designed to absorb. Iran has understood this longer than most adversaries. The IRGC drone program has been developing since the early 2000s. By 2023, Iranian origin drones, Shahed-136 series and their derivatives, had demonstrated the capability to conduct coordinated multi-unit attacks with GPS waypoint navigation and optical terminal seekers that could identify and track a specific target at the end of their flight. The Shahed-136 carries a warhead of approximately 40 kilograms, travels at around 185 kilometers per hour, and has an operational range of up to 2,500 kilometers depending on the variant. At low altitude, below 100 feet above sea level, it presents a radar cross-section that is genuinely difficult to track consistently with conventional ship-based radar systems designed primarily for aircraft and missile threats. 14 of them, inbound at 1:53 in the morning, represented a serious problem. USS Boxer is a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship. It displaces approximately 40,500 tons fully loaded, carries a crew of 1,200, and can embark up to 1,800 Marines and their equipment. It is not a frontline combatant destroyer built around an anti-air warfare mission. Its defensive systems are capable but optimized for a different threat environment: longer-range missiles, conventional aircraft. Its Phalanx CIWS systems and ESSM defensive missiles are effective at range against high-speed threats. Against a swarm of slow, low-flying kamikaze drones closing at subsonic speed from multiple bearings, the geometry becomes considerably more complex. The intelligence picture ahead of that night had been developing for 72 hours. A classified overhead intelligence report had flagged unusual activity at an IRGC logistics facility on the Iranian coast. Specifically, the movement of shipping containers consistent with drone storage and transport to a forward coastal position. The report was logged. It did not generate a formal threat elevation above the standing advisory for the area. The reason it wasn't elevated was both human and structural. The pattern of IRGC drone movement to forward coastal positions had been observed repeatedly over the preceding 18 months. Each previous instance had been a preparation for a land-based attack on regional partners, not a naval strike. The analysts categorizing the intelligence applied their historical baseline. They were not wrong to do so. They were wrong about the future. On the night of the attack, the drones launched from a coastal site on the Iranian shoreline at approximately 1:17. Their initial heading was south-southwest, consistent with a route toward the Yemeni theater, a heading that matched multiple previous observed launches. Their radar signatures, such as they were initially interpreted by the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating in the area as consistent with a Houthi-bound weapons transfer. The reinterpretation came at 01:48 when the lead drone group executed a coordinated heading change to the west. The P-8 crew reported the course change immediately, but the geometry was already set. At 185 kilometers per hour, closing from approximately 47 nautical miles, the first drones would be within their terminal guidance range of Boxer in under 30 minutes. The ship's Combat Information Center went to full air defense posture at 01:53, the moment the threat classification was upgraded from possible to confirmed hostile. The crew had 6 minutes before the leading edge of the swarm was inside Phalanx engagement range. The challenge facing Boxer's air defense watch team in those 6 minutes was not a lack of weapons. The ship had functioning CIWS mounts and ESSM capability. The challenge was geometry and ammunition economy. 14 targets spread across a 40-degree approach arc, flying at between 80 and 150 feet altitude, at closing speeds too slow for the ESSM's engagement envelope to be fully efficient. The ESSM, Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, is optimized for threats at Mach 2 and above. Against a target moving at 100 knots, its intercept probability is technically high, but the guidance system has to manage a very different engagement timeline than its design case. And each ESSM costs approximately $1.5 million. 14 targets times 1 missile each. That's $21 million in defensive fire against a swarm that cost Iran perhaps $280,000 to assemble and launch. The weapons officer had to make fast decisions about what to engage with what. ESSMs were allocated against the 4 lead drones, the ones most likely to reach the ship first if not intercepted. The Phalanx mounts, the 20mm rotary cannon systems, were tasked against the trailing elements of the swarm. Electronic warfare systems were activated simultaneously, attempting to jam the GPS signal feeding the drone's waypoint navigation. The jamming was partially effective. 3 of the 14 drones went ballistic when their GPS signals were disrupted. They flew straight on their last heading rather than maneuvering toward the ship. 2 of those 3 impacted the water. 1 continued on a fixed heading and passed 200 meters clear of Boxer's stern. 4 lead drones were engaged by ESSM launches. 3 were destroyed. 1 ESSM missed. The guidance system tracking a slow subsonic target at low altitude experienced what the post-engagement technical report described as terminal phase tracking anomaly. The 4th drone continued inbound. The Phalanx on the port forward mount engaged it at 340 meters. The Phalanx is a last resort system. It fires 4,500 rounds per minute of 20mm tungsten penetrator rounds from a self-contained radar-guided turret. At 340 meters against a 40-kilogram warhead drone, the engagement happens in less than 2 seconds. The rounds hit the drone. The warhead detonated. The overpressure from the detonation at 340 meters cracked glass on the port bridge wing, damaged a sensor mast mounting, and injured 2 sailors on the signal bridge who were not fully sheltered. 1 sailor sustained a perforated eardrum and lacerations from flying glass. 1 sustained a broken arm from being thrown against a railing by the concussive wave. No penetrating damage to the hull or critical systems. The drone had been stopped, but the swarm was not finished. Of the remaining 7 drones after the initial engagement, those not jammed, not hit by ESSM, not yet in Phalanx range, 3 executed a maneuver at 0159 that the engagement analysis team would spend weeks reconstructing. They had been programmed with a secondary waypoint. When the primary approach vector became congested with defensive fire and jamming, these 3 drones turned north, executed a wide arc, and approached from the ship's stern quarter, the bearing sector that had been partially occupied by the Phalanx mounts engaged with the lead elements. The stern starboard Phalanx was tracking 2 drones on the port side engagement. At the moment the 3 arcing drones came over the horizon from the north, the system automatically prioritized the closer threat. 1 of the 3 arcing drones was engaged and destroyed at 280 meters on the starboard quarter. 1 was jammed at 600 meters and went ballistic. It impacted the water 180 meters from the hull. 1 made it to 90 meters. At 90 meters, the Phalanx had already expended its immediate burst on the adjacent target. The system cycled. The drone detonated over the fantail. The blast shredded the upper portion of the ship's stern communications mast. Shrapnel impacted the flight deck. A fuel line on the aft helicopter deck was punctured, creating a fire that the damage control party had under control within 4 minutes. 2 more sailors were treated for shrapnel lacerations. Both survived. The remaining drones, 4 of the original 14, were destroyed or jammed in the final phase of the engagement. The last hostile contact was splashed at 2:04 a.m., 11 minutes from the first Phalanx firing to the last splash. 4 sailors wounded. 2 communications masts damaged. 1 fire on the flight deck, contained. No fatalities. No penetrating hull damage. The ship was still operational. What came after the engagement? in the 6 hours between 02:04 and dawn, reveals more about the state of U.S. Navy drone defense than the engagement itself. The damage control teams had the fires out. The medical officer had the wounded treated. The communications officer had routed around the damaged mast and restored primary comms within 90 minutes. Boxer remained fully operational as a platform. But the commanding officer of the ship was not thinking about what had happened. He was thinking about what had almost happened. 3 of the 14 drones had gotten inside 100 meters. 1 had detonated at 90 meters. The Shahed-136 variant carries a 40-kilogram warhead. At 90 meters, the shrapnel pattern from detonation is wide, but the blast overpressure is manageable for a ship of Boxer's size. At 30 meters, the warhead does structural damage. At direct impact, which is the weapon's design terminal phase, 40 kilograms of explosive at the base of a superstructure starts fires that are not contained in 4 minutes. It disables radar systems. It kills people in the immediate area. The margin between the ship survived intact and the ship sustained serious damage with significant casualties was the distance between 90 meters and contact. That margin is not a safety buffer. That is a near miss. The after-action report submitted to 5th Fleet the following day was precise about this. The commanding officer wrote that the engagement had demonstrated 3 specific capability gaps in current naval drone defense architecture. The first was the engagement envelope mismatch between ESSM and slow subsonic targets. The second was the phalanx ammunition economy problem in a multi-bearing simultaneous engagement. The third was the vulnerability of aft sector coverage when forward mounts were committed to lead targets. He recommended immediate evaluation of directed energy systems for close-in drone defense. He recommended updated engagement sequencing for swarm attacks. He recommended structural modifications to phalanx mounting positions on amphibious assault ships to improve aft sector overlap. All 3 recommendations were flagged for immediate review. The investigation into how 14 Iranian drones launched from a coastal site without triggering a higher-level threat advisory surfaced the intelligence classification failure in detail. The pattern matching that had led analysts to assume a Houthi-bound transfer rather than a naval strike was examined and formally revised. A new classification protocol was established for IRGCN drone activity within 150 nautical miles of U.S. naval vessels operating in the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman. The protocol change was not announced publicly, but the attack itself became a public event, not through U.S. channels, but because the IRGCN released their own edited footage of the drone launches 6 days later. The footage showed the launch sequence but cut before the engagement results. Iranian state media described the attack as a successful deterrence operation against American aggression. They did not mention that 13 of 14 drones had been destroyed before reaching the ship. The propaganda value of the launch footage was real, regardless of the military result. Other actors watching that footage saw something important. 14 GPS-guided Kamikaze drones could be launched from a coastal site and directed at a U.S. warship. Some of them got through. The cost to Iran was approximately $280,000 in hardware and the political risk of a U.S. military response, which, as Iran had calculated based on the helicopter incident 3 months prior, would be limited and proportionate. The deterrence architecture that had kept major powers from direct confrontation was not broken, but it was under pressure in ways that it had not experienced since the Cold War. A state willing to absorb diplomatic consequences and the risk of a calibrated military response could launch drone swarms at American ships. The threshold for doing so was lower than anyone in naval planning had publicly acknowledged. In the weeks following the attack, 3 separate systems were fast-tracked for evaluation in the naval drone defense role. The DEM SHORAD Directed Energy Program, which had been developing a 50-kilowatt laser system for land-based short-range air defense, was evaluated for naval integration. 2 experimental high-energy laser systems were deployed aboard surface vessels in the region for operational testing under live threat conditions. The testing was not announced publicly. The 4 sailors who were wounded during the engagement were treated and returned to duty within 2 weeks. The sailor with the broken arm returned to full duty in 6 weeks. None of them spoke to media. The communications masts were repaired at a forward naval facility within 4 days. On the 5th day, Boxer was back on its patrol track in the Arabian Sea. The Iranian coastal launch site from which the drones had originated was surveilled continuously by overhead assets for the following 3 months. A P-8 Poseidon maintained an extended patrol pattern over the area. The site was never vacant for more than 48 hours. Whatever came next from that site, the intelligence picture would be current. But the deeper question, the one that naval strategists were working through in quiet rooms at the Naval War College and in the classified strategy cells at the Pentagon, was not about the next launch from that specific site. It was about the precedent. Iran had demonstrated that a swarm of relatively simple, inexpensive drones could penetrate the close-in defense of a major U.S. surface combatant and score hits. The political price Iran paid was a diplomatic protest and heightened ISR coverage of their coastline. The military price was 13 drones destroyed. For $280,000 and a diplomatic note, Iran had put shrapnel on the deck of a U.S. Navy ship. The math that adversaries were doing in response to that outcome is not comfortable. Low-cost drone swarms, fired in sufficient numbers, will eventually exhaust the defensive magazine of any surface ship operating in a confined threat environment. The phalanx is a finite system. The ESSM magazine is not unlimited. Electronic warfare jamming degrades, but does not eliminate a GPS-navigated threat. Directed energy weapons are the theoretical answer, a system that doesn't run out of ammunition as long as it has power, but directed energy systems are not yet deployed at scale across the fleet. Between where the Navy is today and where its directed energy capability needs to be is a gap. Inside that gap, 14 drones flew toward USS Boxer on a warm night in the Arabian Sea. 13 didn't make it. One did. That one is the lesson. Stay vigilant, stay informed. I'll see you in the next one.